I'm Brenda Platt. I am Brenda Platt with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and I'll be moderating this session, Recycling as Infrastructure 2 campaign. We're going to hear from 3 speakers. I'm going to introduce them right before they talk, but they're Gary Liss with Zero Waste Associates, Bob Geddert from the National Recycling Coalition, and Jay Bassett, who is an NRC board member currently. What you're going to hear today is how recycling advocates have banded together and were successful in securing the most federal funding for recycling adopted by Congress in at least my generation. So without further ado, let me introduce Gary Liss with Gary Liss and Associates. He has 49 years experience in recycling. He's a leading advocate of zero waste, and he is the coordinator of the Recycling as Infrastructure 2 campaign. He's also the vice president of Zero Waste USA and past president and lifetime honorary board member of the NRC. And he also served on the town council and was mayor of Loomis, California, in case you guys didn't know that. So Gary, the mic is yours. You don't forget to unmute.
Thanks, Brenda. The Recycling as Infrastructure 2 campaign was begun about a year and a half ago in response to the beginning of a new administration. We wanted to contact them to move forward, and I need to stop share for a second. Sorry about that. There we go. And we wrote a letter to President Biden and Vice President Harris in March of 2021, calling upon them to support recycling, broadly defined as prevention, reuse, recycling, and composting, to be pursued by the administration. We created a change.org petition that Maggie Clark developed for National Recycling Coalition, and NRC led the development of the American Recycling Infrastructure Plan. We had about 50 people sign on to our letter to the president, and then once we launched the Recycling as Infrastructure 2 campaign, we got these 10 organizations to also support the campaign itself. The ones in green became the steering committee for moving forward with the campaign. The American Recycling Infrastructure Plan was initially authored by Bob Geddert on behalf of the National Recycling Coalition, and it was released in July of 2021. And sent to congressional staff, and the media has 50 different initiatives calling for over $18 billion of investment in both physical infrastructure and social infrastructure, including new rules and policies to support the most efficient use of the physical infrastructure. And that was over a 3-year period, and that was before any bills had been adopted by Congress. We joined with a number of other major organizations like ISRI and SWANA and others that were already, and the U.S. Composting Council, that were already championing recycling infrastructure issues. And the coalition was really supportive of each other. The plan built on prior advocacy plans, including ones by the Recycling Partnership, the Food Loss and Waste Policy Action Plan, Break Free from Plastic plans, and the Plastic Free President Priority Plastic Actions developed by the Beyond Plastics campaign, and the Compost Act that was developed by the Compost Infrastructure Coalition. The plan had a key message that at least include the following as eligible activities for all infrastructure projects in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which was known as in 2021. including the use of reuse systems, recycled content, and compost products. That's a message that all of you could champion still today to move forward with asking any infrastructure project in your area to use reuse systems, recycled content, and compost products. Also, EPA is soliciting input on some of their grant funds right now. That would be a good comment for you to send in to EPA. Over the course of the last 2 years, we've been doing monthly webinars on the campaign topic. The ones that are highlighted on the screen in green are ones that once the federal funding was actually adopted and being rolled out, we highlighted in March and June of this year how and when to apply for federal funding. One of the key things is get on grants.gov. It takes a month or two to do that if you're not there already. That's the portal for submitting your applications. Also, 90% of the work to do in getting grants is building your coalition, identifying the project, figuring out partners and other stakeholders to bring together, figuring out what you want to do. That takes 90% of the time. The writing should be about 10% of the effort. So now is the time to be working on next year's grant proposals, pulling together your efforts to pursue those funding. The resources we've got available include the plan and a presentation that Bob Getter did in one of our webinars last July, and a couple of articles that were in different trade journals about the campaign. If you want to stay informed about it, join the Google group Recycling Infrastructure at googlegroups.com. And my contact information I'll leave on until I stop sharing. Thank you for being here today. And next up will be all the information you need to get started on figuring out where to look for the federal funding. And I'll pass it back to you, Brenda.
Thanks, Gary. I don't see any questions in the chat, so we will have time to take a few questions for everybody. So feel free to get those going in the chat, folks. All right, so now Bob Getter. Bob, while you're sharing, you're getting your presentation up, let me introduce you. Bob is the president of the National Recycling Coalition. He is semi-retired after a 45-year career in guiding communities towards sustainable materials management through a systems approach. He's been bridging recycling best practices, working on local economic development practices. He's currently writing a book on actions one can take to slow the effects of climate change, and he teaches a class on climate change at Xavier University in Cincinnati. So welcome, Bob. Your screen looks good. You have the mic.
Thank you. Am I unmuted?
You are. We can hear you just fine.
All right. Thank you. Ready to roll, and thank you much for the introduction. And as we wrote from Gary's presentation on how to apply for federal funds, I wrote into federal funding opportunities as we have been tracking funding from the approved legislation from the infrastructure grants from November of last year. We're approaching the anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of the infrastructure funds, and also some funds that were approved by Congress in February of last year. And let's get this rolling. US EPA infrastructure funding. And Nina Shaw began yesterday in speaking about this grant opportunity. Requests for applications are to be issued almost any day this month. The application details are not released. We do know from the Congressional Act that $275 million will be available over 5 years, 2022 through 2026. It's focused on post-consumer materials management infrastructure grants, a large pool of eligibility. It's also focused on reduce, reuse, recycling, education, and outreach grants. That's a second grant opportunity, a $75 million pool over 5 years, and a large pool of eligibility as well too. There was an RFI document that gave some details and a pool of requesting information from EPA so that they can develop that grant opportunity. And that was in June of 2022. And Nina spoke about the large pool of input from across the country in that. There's a web site there for more information to stay connected. Any day now, these 2 grant opportunities will be released. As Nina stated in her quote, a sea change at Congress in funding opportunities. My quote is, in my 44 years in the recycling world, I have never seen this large pool of funding for recycling opportunities. And this is a huge opportunity for your program to apply for grants from the EPA. Also, greenhouse gas funding from the US EPA, a request for information. It will be issued supposedly around December 5th of 2022. There was a press release issued in November, stakeholder input sessions, November 1st and November 9th. Yesterday was the November 9th stakeholder input session that will help shape this first of a kind federal funding to mobilize clean energy and climate projects to reduce pollution in disadvantaged communities. And if you're in one of those disadvantaged communities, this is $27 billion available in financing and technical assistance for projects that reduce emissions and air pollution, with an emphasis on low income and disadvantaged communities. Climate change activities, by definition of EPA, also includes reuse, waste reduction, and recycling activities as it impacts climate change. So look for this website for further announcements and information. I also moved to the brownfields grants and assistance. These programs have been around for many years, a few decades, but however, they've been refunded through the infrastructure grants program through a large pool of money, far more funding than previously funded, and very much enlarged opportunities through the Brownsfield Grants Assistance. The purpose of the Brownsfield Grants Program to empower states, tribes, communities, and other stakeholders to work together to assess safely clean up and sustainably reuse brownfields resources for recycling properties. These programs, once these brownfields are cleaned up, can be utilized for your recycling and reuse and programs. This is a good source of property for your use in your recycling and reuse programs. And I'm very impressed with Amanda Waddell's program in Gainesville, Florida, in acquiring property through a Brownsfield grant opportunity. So eligible entities, a large scope of eligible entities. Check out the grant opportunities for details. There are, in the Brownsfield programs, assessment grants, cleanup grants, multi-purpose grants, revolving loan fund grants, job opportunity grants. Applications are due in a short order, November 22nd. However, these are annual grants. And as Gary noted, it does take time to develop the cooperative agreements with partners. It does take time to fill out the grants.org application form. So you take a look at the form. These applications due November 22nd. However, you may be gearing up for the 2023 application form, and you might take a look at that opportunity for this year and start working on your application for 2023. Speaking of 2023, there's an open solicitation for the Brownsfield Job Training Grants. And this is for 2023, not 2022. And it's technical assistance to Brownsfield Communities grant solicitation, $5 million over a 5-year period. And this is specifically targeted towards job training programs. Again, You'll find this detail on the Brownsfield program site. Pollution prevention funding will be reoffered in 2023. We've passed the 2022 application time period. Again, time to prepare right now for the 2023 application cycle. Eligibility cycles are pretty broad, broader than in the past. States, tribes, universities, businesses, partners in business, local governments, and nonprofit organizations. And large pool funding, 50% cost and match. You'll note that each of these programs have varying different cost shares. Some have no cost shares. And a request for applications with the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, and there's $13.9 million in a zero cost share, $9 million in the 50% cost share opportunity in this program. Moving to Department of Energy, different department of the federal government. The RFA is not announced on these two programs. This is from the federal, the congressional bill that was approved in November 15th of last year. And we're awaiting a release of the RFA. The Department of Energy will do a competitive grant program. The top one is a battery collection recycling grant program. I think some of you may be interested in that. It's targeted to local retailers towards implementation of project activities. This will be available to private businesses as well as solid waste districts and local governments. However, the details are not released yet. The second one, Battery Recycling Research Development and Demonstration Grant Program, again, not released yet, but this is more of a demonstration grant, research and development and demonstration grant program for the reuse and recycling of batteries. Primarily consumer batteries is the focus here. And they're looking for institutions of higher education, national laboratories, governments, nonprofits, private industries to apply for this grant funding. Don't know on either of these two what the pool of funding is. That has not been released on these two, and that's Department of Energy. Look at their website for further detail. I do have links on each of these pages, so once you get a hold of this PowerPoint, as the Congress releases these PowerPoints, each of these pages has links to the appropriate websites. On this page, different battery styles, electric vehicle battery grant program. The top one is electric vehicle battery recycling and second life grant program. And again, geared towards businesses, research and development and demonstration of electric vehicle batteries. On the top one, the second one is demonstrations and commercial facilities for battery grade components and cell manufacturing and recycling. Both of these, the applications are not released yet. These were funded in the February 11th congressional action. And Department of Energy is working on the grant applications for these as well. No known date for release of the applications yet, but I do have the links on these pages for you to search for and get on the notification list. Moving now to USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, composting and food waste reduction pilots, more expanded dollars for these programs. These programs have been around for a while, but refunded through the infrastructure grant program. Cooperative agreements awarded from $45,000 to $300,000. We have passed the August deadline this year, but it will be reoffered in 2023. Look for an August or September deadline in 2023 and start working on your cooperative agreements. The USDA looks for large cooperative regional grant applications. So think about that as you're looking for composting and waste reduction pilot programs. They are targeting local and municipal governments in this particular grant application. The second one that I just moved to are grant awards $50,000 and $300,000. And they are more geared towards innovative production in the use of compost. And so there's 2 different grant opportunities, again, to be reoffered in August or September of 2023. And again, I have links available on the PowerPoint. Where to find USDA funding opportunities? I have several websites available here on this web page here, and feel free to look for the proper announcements. And all of these federal agencies allow you to link up for subscriber pages for announcements. And I would encourage you to get onto the announcement pages and subscriptions for advance notices. The NRC, and Gary mentioned this in his presentation, the NRC requests that funders include the following uses for all infrastructure projects. You and your local community can encourage this: the use of reuse systems, recycled content products, and compost products in any infrastructure funded, federally funded project. And compost projects can be expanded, for landscaping of buildings, transportation projects, erosion control, bridge embankments, storm water management, stream and lake bank restoration, soil restoration, and so forth. So the expanded definition of the use of compost products, but also recycling content products in all of the infrastructure areas. And we really want to encourage reuse, innovative reuse, wherever possible in the infrastructure dollars that are available from Congress. A new program, this comes from the White House. This is a White House centered initiative affecting 21 federal grant programs. It's called Justice 40. And it's a coordination of justice initiatives. 40% of overall benefits of certain federal investments flow to disadvantaged communities that are marginalized, underserved, and overburdened by pollution. This is very key because it does affect recycling and reuse grants that are available. The categories of investment include climate change, clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and development of critical clean water and wastewater infrastructure. Recycling, waste reduction, and composting fits into the climate change initiatives by definition of the federal government, but also fits into critical clean water and wastewater infrastructure as well. If you read the definitions more carefully, recycling does fit in by the climate change definition. The covered federal investments include any grant or procurement spending, as well as other cost and financing. The 21 federal agencies include the 3 agencies I just mentioned: USDA, Department of Energy, and US EPA. This is new opportunity to engage with underserved communities. You may have underserved communities in your area or adjoining communities that you may participate in.
If you could wrap up, that would be terrific.
I'm getting very close. Thank you, Brenda, for the notice. I do want to emphasize what Gary noted, grants.gov. Grants.gov has 2 purposes. You can search for grants in grants.gov, and it's very useful to search for the grants you're looking for in grants.gov. But more importantly, you begin the grant application process in grants.gov, and all the federal grants are pointing you to the grants.gov to apply for the grants. And it's important that you start in the grants.gov to begin your grant application. And it does take quite a bit of time and effort to apply for a grant application. Some of the presentations that the NRC has presented are noted on this slide, and Gary mentioned that earlier. I also note the EJ facility mapping tool, which is also utilized by US EPA for grant applications. Other resources that are available for grants are Resource Recycling, Grant, and Grant Watch, and there's some links there for you to research for other grant opportunities. And finally, my last slide, contacts with the NRC for our Recycling is Infrastructure 2. Myself, Gary Liss, Pete Adrian, and Rick Anthony. We've all been involved in the Recycling is Infrastructure 2 campaign, and we're available if you have any further questions. And that concludes my PowerPoint.
Thanks, Bob. While Jay, our next speaker, while you're bringing up your slides, let me just say that, Bob, I was adding links as the best of my ability as you were talking, so people could get them in the chat. And there was one additional I added, which was the USDA under the Rural Development Program. Biden administration is a new fertilizer kind of production expansion program, Made in America fertilizer and alternative nutrients and composting. Does count, and the first application window closes November 14th. So, and the second application window closes December 29th for those of you who want to ruin your New Year's Eve. But
thank you.
Yeah, so check that out if you're a composter. All right, so let me. Oh, and I wanted just to say, you know, we've been focusing on federal money, which obviously is the focus of this session, but there's a lot happening at the local level on grants for reuse. And since you mentioned that, Bob, I put in the chat just now an example from the DC Department of Energy and Environment, which is giving out small grants to ditch the disposables. And it has just been exploding, supporting the transitions from single use to reusable foodware, for example. So if you're a local government or with a local agency, there's more you can do to build reuse infrastructure in your local community. Okay, without further ado, let's get to our last speaker, Jay Bassett, who probably now is just wearing the hat community development connector and more. Jay has served the public over 35 years, both as a retired military officer with the Navy and as a civil servant leader with the U.S. EPA. With EPA, he has worn many hats, including as the Region 4 Materials Management Program Chief, which is how I first met him. But he's also been a charter member of EPA's leadership cadre in transforming the agency's land and waste programs road ahead principles. As part of that work, he's been promoting sustainable materials management approaches. As a senior advisor, he's advocated for the agency's commitment to achieving meaningful outcomes in disproportionately underserved and vulnerable communities. He retired from EPA last summer, 2021, but not from the sustainability field. And today he continues to serve on several advisory boards for a number of local and national nonprofits. And I love, Jay, that you're advancing K through 12 initiatives and green school programs. So Jay, it's a pleasure to have you join the session too. The mic is yours.
Thank you, Brenda. Happy to be here and glad to be part of this conversation. Hey, Brenda, I thought I'd just relate to you that it's an amazing thing on K-12 programs when we had 3rd and 5th graders use the EPA USDA food audit guide to do food audits in cafeterias that in 6 months changed policy for how a school district with 186,000 kids serves food that drove a 40% reduction in wasted food. So that's the power of K-12. So I appreciate that. So my purpose today and what Gary and Bob kind of talked to me about, I wanted to maybe give you a couple things, a little bit of an example, maybe on the ground and some of the work I'm doing on how this coordination of federal resources can be brought together in some interesting ways. And that as you bring those things together, it opens up the door to other funding sources that you might not be thinking about that can be brought to the table, again, in some interesting ways. And so I was going to tell you a little bit of a journey. And one of the organizations I belong to and helped found when I was the Region 4 Materials Chief, which is the Life Cycle Building Center in Atlanta, Georgia. The Life Cycle Building Center is really focused on, it's a community-based asset, as we like to call it. It uplifts and serves the community on reuse of materials, but it's a mission-based organization. So those materials actually go back into the community to drive better opportunities. And as you see this picture here, what I maybe want to entertain as we start the conversation is that building you see is an old historic factory that is being adaptively reused as the building reuse center for the a number of communities in the west end of Atlanta. As you look through there, you'll notice that it's been, a lot of, as an old building that came in, it's got a lot of issues with it. And as part of the life cycle building center journey, this was one where EPA and the Brownsfield grants were brought in and did the site assessment and site cleanup. That also became the seed for a capital campaign to be able to do the renovations that need to be done to make it into a not just a better functioning center, but also one that, quite frankly, met occupancy requirements. So, these things, like as Bob had talked about, Brownsfield assessment grants and cleanup grants, or even the use of targeted Brownsfield assessments, which I think are an underutilized tool that many folks don't realize because it's a one-page application. To do are ways to bring some federal funding in that can be a seed for a larger investment as well. So, so I wanted to. That's why the value of this picture and kind of set some context.
Jay, I hate to interrupt you, but is there a way to? It's just blocking the title where it's says mute, stop, share. Are you seeing that on top of your screen? Maybe just move the cursor. I'm not gonna. If you can't do it in a second, we're not gonna worry about it.
I can't do it.
Okay, all right, we're not gonna worry about it.
Yeah, sorry about that. So one of the things, and kind of just to engage on how this might look, is Life Cycle Building Center received a grant from Region 4 EPA on workforce development, which we've been talking about. And the idea is that as we look at material flows from building reuse, that if we're not thinking about building the skill set for deconstruction skills and providing those opportunities in the marketplace, that the policy changes that the city of Atlanta wanted to do in terms of maybe putting in, and there's been some conversations around ordinances about requiring deconstruction, really couldn't be advanced. So LBC has had this grant for a number of years. COVID came through, and they came out of COVID saying, well, what are we going to do and how are we going to do that? And that's when Shannon Goodman, their executive director, came to me, and I was on the advisory board then, and now I'm on the board, said, can you help us figure out how to do this? And I said, that would be fine. We can do this, but I want to do it in the context of looking at Life Cycle Building Center as one of many community organizations. And that if we really want to do workforce development, we want folks coming from the communities that LBC serves and bring them into and develop their skills and put them back into their communities with, in essence, living wages and benefits as part of the training. So we're not just training folks and just kind of throwing them out there, and that we're looking at working with other community organizations that represent these communities that can recruit and find and also support folks that come into the development program. And then we would work to make sure that they, would go into career pathways that are different than just jobs, that kind of set up a structure to go. So for example, real quick was, we were talking yesterday with Atlanta Tech, which is an Atlanta technical school. They're looking at partnering with Life Cycle Building Center as part of this project and this community-based effort of including a sustainability certificate that includes deconstruction that these folks that we're going to train out of these communities can take advantage of. That is also added to some of the trade degrees that come out of that school under construction management, carpentry skills, facility management program they're just now building, in civil engineer technology. So in essence, we're trying to build a set of skills that they can take with them all the way through. So that's kind of the journey we're on right now. And we're doing that through what we call asset-based community development, which I'll hit on next. The last thing I'll tell you is we're working on a community reuse toolkit that's with Build Reuse. And we're looking at how to embed some of these processes and practices on building community reuse capability capacity as a community-based asset as part of a toolkit. And there was a data collection piece that has been done, and they're in the process. We are in partnership with Build Reuse of building out what that toolkit would look like, and it's going to come in many parts and pieces. And we can always have a deeper conversation what that might look like. So I put in the chat and hopefully most folks that maybe had a chance to take a look at it, that the process we're using is what we call asset-based community development, what you call ABCD. And the reason this is important, Bob had mentioned some of these other grants from USDA, EPA, environmental justice, the Justice 40, which is really about building and we call, and EPA's actually got a program called this Thriving Communities. And so asset-based community development becomes a way of convening a different kind of conversation within communities around community assets, map those assets to bring them together to work in a more concerted way. And the reason that's important, I think, for the reuse and recycling industry is that municipal services can provide some value to the value chain and the things they do well. But when we start looking at the reuse economy and we start looking at things like composting, community composters, we start looking at things like urban ag systems with community composters. When we start looking at things like centers for hard to recycle materials, these are really community-driven opportunities with a community-driven mission and business model, both profit and nonprofit. And what I'm interested here and what we're doing at LBC is how do we build the network of those community assets that work together that can be competitive in applying for and advancing the shared vision of being complementary to local municipal systems through building capacity and the development of community assets, which in this case include reuse and recycling infrastructure that goes beyond what municipal governments can provide, and really build that in a systematic approach. So as we talk about asset-based community development, the key thing here I want you to note is that there's two ways we generally look at communities. Either we look at it as deficiencies and needs, or we can look at it assets and capacities. So as we look at it from a perspective of, and this is just an example of deficiencies versus opportunities, this is an observation of the same community. And you can see, you can look at it from one of two ways. You can look at it to say that you have a community that has a lot of needs out there. They have problems, there's problems that need to be fixed. How would that be fixed? Or you can look at to say out there that we have a set of community assets out there that can be built from and uplift. And as we look at those assets, they can include a number of associations, institutions, and other things that provide value back into that community. And the question is, which side do you want to work on? Do you want to work on the old way of addressing needs, or do we want to work on building opportunities? And I'm here to tell you that, the way we're looking at this and trying to do this in partnership with Georgia Institute of Technologies and others is through what we call building on opportunities. So just to give you a quick example of what that looks like is, typically as we do a needs-based approach, it's focused on needs, response to problems. It's charity oriented, which means fixing a problem or putting a Band-Aid on. Food banks is a good example of that. It fixes a need for a day, but it really doesn't get at building better communities or addressing root causes. Focus on individuals. And then I want to note in here that it's program centered and people are clients. And so the approach that we're taking at is building this coalition, which we think will open up the door to a number of funding opportunities to help build this reuse and recycling infrastructure we're talking about as a concerted effort within the Atlanta communities, is an asset-based approach which focuses really on people are the answer. It comes from relationships and focuses on communities and associations. And the idea, as you see, is there is to be investment oriented and set up success for investments. So I just wanted to point out, as we talk about community assets, that there are a wide range of different community assets. There's institutions, which can include colleges, universities. Matter of fact, it's always interesting as we talk about Georgia Tech and Atlanta that there's a partnership growing between Georgia Tech, the technical colleges, and the four-year undergrad serving college of being a little bit more concerted on how they better serve community in terms of workforce development for the green economy. That's now part of this coalition we're building underneath this project with EPA's Sustainable Material Management Grants as part of a concerted effort within the coalition to bring joint resources to do. But it could also include churches and faith-based. It can include neighborhood associations, community gardens. So, there is a process or way of actually mapping out these community assets and then doing what we call convening and connecting to bring them together, where each organization does its own thing, but realizes they got to reach across, and they may have to give up some things to work with others, but they get a lot more in return. And so how do we set up the network and the structure to do that, what they call an impact network? So just real quick, here's a couple of principles of ABC. I put some links in the chat if you're interested in doing that. These are some of the principles that we're trying to employ in this project that has brought together this now robust coalition. So some of the things we've been able to do with the city of Atlanta, where we're actually able to bring in, we brought a human-centered design through the Museum of Design Atlanta as part of this coalition, that they actually worked with the city housing department along with community, LBC and the community organizations representing the coalition to really look at up and downstream for building reuse materials, both as a way of pushing it through the center back into good, but also really looking at it, what does it mean for back in the community as well? So in this case, are we fulfilling the demand for deconstruction by using through a City of Atlanta housing that we're going to be building what we call Rebuild Atlanta, of working with homeowners in the communities that are part of the coalition to improve energy efficiency and also what we call equity theft through some other policies, which we don't need to dive in today, to make home improvements through reuse materials as a way of pulling that out, as we also drag it in from the upstream side as we train and put people into that workforce. So we may be looking at workforce development that does with Atlanta housing that not only has deconstruction skills, but knows how to reuse those materials and do assessments in energy efficiency and home improvements that support a City of Atlanta housing affordable project. And so that's the kind of things you get to kind of think about and dream and actually put into action through an asset-based community development, convening, and coalition building. So some of the impacts, again, this was not LBC, this was not me. This is what the community said they wanted as part of this workforce development grant and opportunity of really, leading what we call legacy journey residents, those that want to stay in their house through. So with that, I want to quickly turn back to the Inflation Reduction Act and the environmental justice block grants. And the reason that this is, I wanted to bring this back around as we look at Brownsfield is these coalitions that really look at and that bring that community voice forefront into this conversation on building community asset capabilities, such as reuse economy or the reuse centers or centers for hard to recycle materials or glass collection, new entrepreneurs that we're seeing, say, up in Cobb County that are doing it by neighborhood, the community composters, that this becomes a way of convening a community voice with those community assets that can be really competitive for the $2.6 billion in environmental justice block grants that are coming out. As a matter of fact, the asset-based community development approach has been one that is being talked about by the Interagency Council for Justice 40 as something that they're considering as part of how they look at their processes of engaging against those 40 programs or so that Bob had mentioned. So I'll skip this just so you know that EJ grants have expanded what they can do. So I do want you to be aware that there's more that can be done with EJ grants now than in the past, because it actually includes some hard things around infrastructure that can actually be built underneath the EJ environmental justice grant programs. So there's three parts to this program that's coming out. One is the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers. If you're not aware of it, those RFPs are already out. And the idea behind this, and this was the conversation even as I was leading the agency, that if they're really going to work and bring these small community organizations to the table to be able to manage and be able to push out good projects with the amount of funding coming through the Justice 40, which the 2.6 billion is just a small piece of it, that maybe, and this was one with the Department of Energy, maybe there needs to be a way of putting together a separate organization that can work with these communities to build community capacity and provide technical assistance to build those good projects and convene the coalitions to be able to take advantage of the environmental justice grants. So as we speak in Atlanta, there's a couple of them that have applied for this. And there's 10 of them that are going to be across the region, as you see here. It closed in early November. They're looking at making those award decisions in February. But when they do come out, that's a resource for anyone here that wants to do a community-based approach for building and supporting community capacity development and help, if you want to apply for and do and bring together a coalition to be able to take advantage of some of the Justice 40 initiatives. Keep in mind, again, there's just a couple of goals with that. It has to be community driven, right? So it's not about us, not necessarily just the asset itself, but it has to come from the community. It also is requiring interagency collaboration coordination. So those centers are going to be a resource center of connecting back to all those resources that Bob talked about, and that they're going to really focus on community-centric collaborations, i.e. the asset-based community development approach that we're doing at Lifecycle Building Center that now opens the door, and it has already started to open the door to a wide range of grants. So if you didn't notice, I put in the chat the DOE grant on the prize. That's something that the coalition is now putting together an application for, as it covers workforce development. We all know that the reuse of materials from energy efficiency improvements set up, things for community-wide solar that's being done by Groundswell and Spellman. So, these are all being kind of addressed within the coalition, within their different pieces, but it's being integrated in a coordinated and strategic way. So the other thing I want you to be aware of is the restructuring of EJ small grants. This is another experiment by both the agency on this, where in essence, what they want to do is to say most community organizations or these community assets we're talking about don't have the capacity or capability of generating a 60-page RFP or responding to that. So they're looking at doing an award to a large nonprofit college and university collaboration that they will be the grantee or the grantors or the funders that work with local communities and those communities entities as trusted entities to be able to bring more communities into the fold and line them up and set them up with access to federal funds and good projects. So I think the way it's intended to go, this restructuring and this fund the funder model, along with the thriving communities model, sets what I think is going to be the platform for, oops, I guess I didn't put it in there. Oh, it's going to set the platform for that right there, which is the $2.6 billion in environmental justice block grants that will be coming out later. I think they're anxious to go in early 2023. And so building these kind of community-based coalitions we're talking about, because if you look at who can be awarded this money, is community-based nonprofit organizations is where it's got to go, as I understand it, or it's community-based non-government NGOs working with other community-based NGOs, or with other community-based NGOs working with certain institutions, and that can come together as a coalition to be able to access those funds. So with that, I'll end it and turn it back over to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Jay. Let's think you can stop screen sharing. Just hit that red button up at the top. Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. What was that? Assessing needs versus looking at building opportunities. And it's so interesting because working for a nonprofit myself, most of the private foundations, they always want a statement of need. It's, what are the problems you're addressing? The framing is the opposite of what you're suggesting. And I love that you had libraries listed on that graphic on community assets. I am in a public library right now in a phone booth, which is awesome. So we have lots of community assets, within our communities, and we should be building and leveraging those. There's no questions in the chat. So guys, put your questions in there. We have at least 6 minutes. So I'll start out. If Gary and Bob could show your video, put your video on. I want to ask, and I'll start with you, Jay, is with all these federal solicitations and opportunities for cities and NGOs to respond, do you, Jay, know, can an entity apply for more than one grant? You know, how do federal agencies view, I don't want to call it double dipping, but something along those lines? Let's say you get funded from USDA and from EPA. How do you have any recommendations for how those proposals should be written?
So I think it's really important that you do that, because I think what USDA and EPA would like to see is that you're leveraging these different opportunities so that the sum is better, greater than the individuals, I think is really important. And, even as I mentioned, the workforce development grant we're doing under SMF, it doesn't have the capacity to do all the things that the community has envisioned. So we're bringing other funders to the table, both government, but keep in mind those government funders is also a way of bringing philanthropic and other equity interest, because it's about investments that go beyond just the federal. And as you had mentioned, city, because in this case, we also have the city through they're accessing money through HUD, what they call the RAD program, that's going to partly fund this workforce development. So the thing we got to think about is not about you as the organization, how many you can fund or not fund or apply for. It's how you as a coalition get smart about it and say, well, we've got this over here. Oh, city, you can pull those HUD money in. We've got, the technical school that can bring in some state education money, that we bring it together in a really interesting way.
Yeah.
I'd like to elaborate on that. In the chat, I talked about the reuse corridor of Central Appalachia that was highlighted in yesterday's session on resource recovery parks. And I noted in the chat for this session, they got $500,000 from EPA Brownfield, $75,000 from U.S. Department of Agriculture, $8 million from the Economic Development Administration, which is just being started up now, and other local funding that they highlighted as well. So the way Jay just described it is for NRC members and particularly state recycling organizations, find community-based non-governmental organizations and colleges and universities, and focus on underserved and disadvantaged communities, and you will have a great shot at getting a lot of this federal funding if you pull together all those pieces. And the state recycling organizations may not have that capacity right now, but they may be able to partner with some of the organizations that are doing this, the small grants to other organizations, to build your capacity to then leverage more through your network of reuse, recycling, composting folks in your states. So this is a huge opportunity to pull together resources in a unique way, which is why we wanted Jay to highlight this whole asset-based community development approach. It's different. It's going to be, don't just think EPA anymore. It's every federal agency is fair game. We got $5 million from the U.S. Department of Labor to just do training programs in California.
Yeah,
think about it.
The Department of Labor has more money out there. They can provide stipends for all these students that you want to pull out of for workforce development. People don't know that. And there's entities in each state that have a direct line. All you have to do is make a request.
That's a good point.
And Jay mentioned in one of our earlier webinars for the campaign that the easiest federal grant to pursue is brownfield grants. Do you want to mention that, Jay?
Just real quickly, because we do have at least one more question I want to ask you guys.
Okay.
So just real quick, I just want to tell you that the underlooked brownfield method is what we call TBAs, Targeted Brownfields Assessment. That's one where a community can come in with a one-page application on a piece of property and get the agency. It's a grant, but it's really agency comes in and does the assessment themselves. They'll provide technical assistance like community visioning and community revitalization, redevelopment of that asset visioning. And then they're even willing and could be willing to work with them on developing the grant application. So for the cleanup, so, there are tools out there no one's really tracking that is what I call the the target easy on button, you can hit it.
All
and
right,
move
so
forward.
let me get to this last question since we have 1 minute. So Karen O'Brien from the Michigan Recycling Coalition asks, how is education being treated in all these opportunities? Bob?
Yeah, quick answer. US EPA had some listening sessions over the summer for their grant opportunities. And the one thing they heard, they heard a lot, and Nina Shaw mentioned it yesterday, quite a bit of input over the summer. But one of the themes that they heard was the lack of education in responding to negative recycling, false advertising on recycling. There's a need to say that recycling is real and to combat some of the false images of recycling. And US EPA heard that messaging. And so one of the grant opportunities that's going to be released in the next week or two is education and outreach. They really want to give out some money for education and outreach. And
All right.
it's going to be pretty broad.
Yes, thank you. That's all the time we have. We actually now are a minute over, but I just want to thank the presenters, thank Alina Beckerman for her TA support, technical assistance support with the session, and just underscore, I think Gary and Bob, you made this point, it is not, even though some of these solicitations are not out yet, it is time to get your collaborators and stakeholders and all the paperwork going now. Do not wait. And usually for federal agencies, there's a 60 to 90-day window, but it may be sooner. We don't know that yet for some of these. So act now. All right. Thank you, guys.
And it's all about relationships. Build your relationships and build your partnerships.
There you go. All right. Recycling is infrastructure too. We got it.
All right, thanks everybody. And I just wanted to note that there are fun things happening in GatherTown. So get your coffee break, get some snacks, and make your way over to GatherTown for all of the things that are out there to network, mingle, and connect.